Okay, so we're going to piece the C block together, and we're going to talk a little bit about how I subcut and how I look at what pieces are going to fit where, and will I have enough fabric. So one of the biggest mistakes, there are a few big mistakes. One of the first big mistakes that beginning paper piecers do is they cut with their fabric right side up and with their template lines facing right side up. And this is wrong because the first piece of fabric that we will lay down is going to be wrong side down, like this. So this is for C1. And the reason is we need to have right sides together. It's always the same thing with every single thing that we sew. We always sew with the right sides together. So in order to get right sides together with this, we need to start with the first piece only right side down. So I've flipped my fabric over and the right side is facing down on my cutting mat. And the next thing that I like to do is put a little bit of glue. I like clear glue because it dries clear and it tends to not burn. So then I'm going to stick that to the wrong side of the fabric. So wrong side of the fabric and the wrong side of the template are going to be matching. And then the next thing that I will do is I'm going to trim off some of the excess. And what you may notice is that I leave a little bit around the edges. I don't trim right up to the dotted line because the fabric can shift. So I want to make sure that the fabric is going to stay right where I put it. Something that you might see in other videos that other instructors or designers do is they score all of their lines, and while it might make it a little bit easier in the beginning, it really it compromises your paper template. So I score the line that I'm going to be sewing, and then I'm going to trim off this part now just because I don't have any use for it right now. And in all honesty, since there are only 3 lines that I have to sew here, this would be fine to score all of them. But when you have a piece like this one, if you would go in and score all of these and then you would make a mistake on, say, one of these smaller pieces here and you have to take it out, you risk losing all of this little bit of paper. So I find that it is so much easier to score only the line that I'm going to be sewing on next and maybe one additional. So for this one, because I don't need this extra bit right now, I'm just going to trim it off now. And I'm not going to fold this over and score it with my thumbnail. I'm just using just the tips of my fingers, and I have lined the edge of my ruler up right on top of the sew line. We're going to be sewing right on top of the solid line. And then I fold it over, and then I use the dashed side of my ruler, and it is denoted with a 1/4 inch seam. And I always use the same side of my ruler because there can be some variation from side to side, and I have noticed that with my rulers, one side is more accurate than the other. So especially with this one, this is the one that I use most of the time, I always use the same side of the ruler. So I'm going to lay that on top of the paper template where it is scored, so I line it up right on that score line, and then I'm going to trim right along the edge of my ruler, and then I'll fold that back out because I don't need it right now and I don't want to confuse myself. So the next thing that I will do is the same thing with the line between the line between C1 and C2. And again, I just put the edge of my finger up and I just run it along, but I'm not looking for a hard crease. I just need to move it out of my way. Okay, so then I see that the next bit I need is this fabric here, and I only have a little bit, so I'm hoping that I have enough. Otherwise I have to re-record my video. I really don't want to do that. But I do really like this fabric, and I'm not going to worry too much about if some of these little pieces get in. I think it'll be okay. We are looking for the fabric that is going to go in this section here. You have the right sides together. So you can see that I have my right side here, and I have my right side facing up. For all the other pieces, it's only the first one that you lay down that will be wrong side up and the right side down. So our template is folded over, and I know that you have a little bit of a hard time seeing, so I'm going to mark. This is my sew line. So that means that I need to have fabric that extends like this, enough here and here. So I'm most concerned about what is going to be in this section right here. So I'm going to line this up here. I'm going to take a peek at what is going on underneath, and I have plenty of room, and because I am really on a mission to conserve my fabric for this little section, I think I might move it up just a hair. So what I've done is I've lined up the raw edge of the fabric, and I'm only concerned about the fabric that is in this section here. I'm not concerned about anything over here. I'm not concerned about this over here. I'm not concerned about anything here. It is only what is going on in the section that I have folded over that I am going to be sewing next. This I will need to be mindful of for the next part, but we have a different line. This line is where we'll fold it over. So for your first line, make sure that what you have in this section, you have enough fabric. And I can lift up this here, and I can see that I have plenty of fabric. So I'm going to open this back up, and I will pin it. Okay, so we'll go ahead and pin that. That's all we do for right now. So what we are going to do now is we are going to sew the first seam. And what we will be doing is we'll be sewing right along this solid line between here and here. And I'm going to go a little bit before and a little bit after. I don't need to backstitch at all. I have lowered my stitches to 1.6. But about 1.5 to 1.6 is a really great place to be for your stitch length. You don't want too short and you don't want too long. If you have stitches that are longer than 1.6, what is going to happen is when you remove the papers, the stitches are going to pull out, or they're going to loosen, and then it's going to affect the way that your block looks. So make sure that you lower your stitches, and I have my needle in the center of my presser foot. And I'm going to go a few stitches before to a few stitches after, and you don't need to backstitch because the size of the stitch length is so short that it really helps lock in the stitches. So you can see that I'm just a little bit before and just a little bit after. So I like to set the seam first, and then I press it back. Okay, so the next thing that I will do is I'm going to score along the next sew line to trim off the excess that I don't need. I find that it is so much easier to trim off before I sew, so that I'm not trying to figure out where the fabric is supposed to be, where my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance is. It just makes it so much smoother and easier. It helps my brain. It just keeps sewing really enjoyable. Okay, so the next thing, what I do, I open this back up just to eyeball where in the fabric I'm going to place this larger bit. I'm looking over here at B5, and I know that I need to have a larger section kind of in here. So I think I want to save this. So I'm going to use this section over here. So I just open it just to get an eyeball of how big it is, and then I fold it back over. Now, anytime that you have this going on up here, you need to make sure that you have fabric that is going to extend this way. It would be really tempting because you see your seam goes from here to here and you think, oh, I have plenty of fabric. But then what happens when you open it up is you discover that you've missed this entire section here. So I'll turn it around the right way. Okay, so while your template is closed, take a look at, just like we did with the last bit, take a look at where the edge of this piece is going to be. And I can see that I need to move this down because yes, the seam does stop right up here, but I have all of this fabric in this section right here, and I don't have anything else that I will need to be sewing, so I need to make sure that I have enough fabric that's going to be covering this amount. So I line the edge, the raw edge of my fabric up, and I'm going to pin. You might not pin, but I find that between laying it down and taking it over to my sewing machine, just the 8 or 12 inches is enough to shift the fabric, and I don't really like that. I want it to stay put. Okay, so a few stitches before to a few stitches after, and we're just sewing right along that solid line. And there you can see that that's all that we have done. I'm just cutting off some of these longer threads. Okay, so we'll do the same thing again. We'll turn it over and press. And because we have taken the extra step to trim before we sew, we don't have to trim anything, and then that also means that we don't have any sort of mistakes really that are going to happen because we've already placed the fabric down where it needs to be. We've already trimmed off all of the excess. I found that when I started trimming before I sewed and before I pressed, I didn't have any more pieces that ended up being cut in the middle, and then I would have to re-sew them and that was really frustrating. The other thing that I really like to do is I like to press between each of the seams because it makes it lay down really, really nicely. Alright, so I'm going to just cut off a little bit here, and I take a look at how wide some of the pieces are. And generally I try to cut the my little pieces about between 2.5 and 3 inches. I find that that's really a good amount to subcut, and then I can use it in future projects. And because I have a selvage here, I am going to go with the longer 3-inch. And I'm really not the most exact when it comes to this, so please don't yell at the TV. I can't hear you. And you know, we all find things that work well for us, and this just works well for me. All right, so I only need just a teeny tiny bit, so I'm going to just cut off a little bit. I prefer to not have the whole piece of fabric. I know that it is a little bit of a waste, but again, I have found that if I have a whole bunch of fabric that I am working with, I tend to make more mistakes. So I like to cut things down into smaller, more manageable pieces so that I don't make mistakes. All right, so we're going to sew C4. We have the right side of the fabric facing up because we need to have right sides together. Another way that it can kind of be a clue to you is if you see the wrong side of the fabric right here and you see the right side facing up, that should be an indication that you have the right pieces together. And I'm just looking to see what I have going on in this section, and I can see that the fabric extends all the way over. I could even sew it this way, but I'm going to sew it this way. I have enough fabric for it to be sewn this way. I just don't want to. I feel like there's going to be less waste going this way. And this is a smaller piece, so I'm going to try my luck and not pin it. Wish me luck. So we're just going to sew a little bit before, a little bit after, and then we are going to press. Now for these outside pieces, outside of the template, I should say, I like to put just a little bit of glue down because I want all of my pieces, when I'm joining them together, I don't want them to shift at all. So when I discovered that I could use glue to hold these down, any of these little flappy bits, it was such a huge game changer because I was always having pieces shift on me and then the block didn't look right. So just a little bit of glue, make sure it's a water soluble glue. I don't use an expensive fabric, it's just cheap Scholastic school glue that I get at the office supply store when the school supplies are on sale. So it really doesn't have to be really, really fancy. Okay, so I've trimmed just off this little bit. Now your next step will be to trim down along the dotted line. Don't trim on the solid line because any solid line is going to be a sew line. So I line the dotted edge of my ruler up right on top of the solid sew line, and then I trim along the edge of the ruler. I never use the edge of my ruler on the side of the template. I find that when I do that, it doesn't cut precisely. Sometimes the lines don't print out straight. Sometimes they bleed too much. So if you cut inside or outside, that doesn't matter so long as you're using the 1/4 of an inch on your ruler on top of the sew line. Then you make sure that all of your pieces are going to be identical. If you use the outside of the line as where you're cutting, you have more room for error and more room for mistakes. And the beautiful thing about foundation paper piecing is that you can have really incredible detail and far more precision. So it's frustrating when we go to the effort of having really nice straight sew lines and then the template is off. So what I'm doing is I'm just trimming as best I can on top of the dotted line with my scissors, and then we can see that this is really going to turn out great. Okay, so in the next part I am going to show you how to piece all of the templates together and create your final block. So go ahead and sew all of your pieces in the exact same manner in numerical order. So do your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way through, and sew on your lines, trim all of your pieces, and then in the next segment we'll be stitching all of those together. Okay, for the next part we are going to sew all of our pieces together. So we have our first piece that we are going to sew is A to B. We have these nice big pieces here. So what we're going to do is line up the top of the block in both places so that we get a really nice crisp seam. I like to place my pins away from the sew line so that I can pull them out or pull them back rather, and the pins stay put and they hold the piece together. And then we have a couple of pieces that have a little bit more bulk. So again, I'm going to pin farther back where there's less bulk so that those pieces don't shift. And then we will follow the same steps as before. Put the presser foot down on the top of the sew line, and I'm going to sew from edge to edge on this one. And I go a little bit slower. I like to sew really fast, but I'm going to go a little bit slower over these seams, especially where I have any extra bulk, so that I make sure that nothing shifts and shimmies. Okay, then the next thing that we will do is we're going to remove the seam allowance papers, and we'll also remove these little pieces here. Any of these little inside pieces that are really little become a pain to remove the papers later. So we need to make sure that we leave all of these here. So A7 has to stay, and A3 and all of those, because we haven't sewn them yet. Okay, flip it over and repeat on the other side. I'm going to remove B2 because of the tiny point that once the seam is pressed open, it's going to be harder to remove. And I don't remove all of the paper. I figure if I get about 90–95% done, that's close enough for me. I feel like the paper will dissolve when it's washed. And then I like to press the seams open. That helps to distribute any of the bulk, so then your piece will lie much flatter. All right, next we're going to take E, and we're going to sew it just to the top over here. So same method, And for this, what I do is I take a look at what I have going on, and I need to look over here to see if we have any seams that have to match up. And I don't think that we do. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the top of the seam is going to be straight across. So I like to put my fingers in the seam allowance. And then what I do is I just move them down. I just shimmy it into place, and I like that. So sometimes these little corners are helpful, and sometimes they really are not helpful. So just kind of shimmy them into place. And if it's off a little bit, it will be just fine, because in the whole quilt, it will all look really great. And if you're concerned about it, you can sew with a basting stitch and then come back. The only problem would be if you sew more than one seam, that you wouldn't be able to come back. So if you get the top of the seam, that's really going to be the most important. And I think we're going to be pretty close. I might be off by about a 1/16 of an inch. And then be careful with that piece there. All right. So this says to press and set aside. And I'm going to just let that kind of do its thing over there. So then we have C and D. And again, I just like to give an eyeball to see if there's something going on the inside that needs the inside to match. And I think, again, this is one that is more dependent on the outside. So just keep wiggling it till it's where you want it to be. And it looks like the corner, the bottom corner of D needs to match right down here. And sometimes these shift. And if they shift, then just move your pins so that they go where they need to go. I like to just take a little bit of extra time on these steps, just to make sure that the edges match up and the seams are where I want them to be. The oh goodness was that the needle housing on my machine was moving. It's a little bit finicky. Okay, so this is the outside of the block, so we can remove D3. And I think I'm going to leave D1 or D2 for right now. Definitely leave D1 because that needs to join up to F, the F block. One of the benefits to using a little bit of the glue stick is that you can remove these little pieces because the glue is holding the paper together. The other advantage to the glue is that if you make a mistake, you have the glue that's already there that's holding it together a little bit more. So I joke that it's like kindergarten over here. I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say obsessed, but I do really like my paper and glue. And I'm going to press this open. Sometimes the seams like to tell me where they want to go, and sometimes I can tell the seams where they ought to go. All right, now we need to sew. Oh, this is turning out really nice. I'm glad I went with these colors. This is great. Okay, so A, B, and E to C, D. Now these little tabbed corners should line up pretty well, but what I want to do is put my thumb over some of these sections where they ought to line up and just make sure that they don't need to be kind of coerced. And I think they will be fine, but you know, sometimes your sewing can be really precise and then the pieces, the templates don't go together really well, and it's really frustrating. So if that happens, it's not you, it's not the pattern, it's just the nature of working with a smaller sized block, with something that's a little bit more detailed, and sometimes our stitching can be off just a little bit. If that happens, it's okay. We have a seam allowance for a reason, and part of that reason is to make it submit to us. So you can just shimmy it just a little bit. I've had to do that, and then when I sew the blocks together, they look really, really well. But I'd rather take the time to make sure that what is going on the inside of the block is the way that I want it, rather than having the outsides of the templates line up. I hope that makes some sense. All right, so remove some of these pieces. It will help your block to lay a lot flatter. And I definitely remove all of the paper pieces before I sew the blocks together. Here's one that this little bit is just not going to come out. It's just there until it comes out in the wash. That's okay. I'm fine with that. I probably should have checked to make sure that my pieces were where I wanted them before I started removing my papers, but that's okay. Oh, good. That came together really nicely. So that was one area that I needed to make sure. And this one says to press the seams open, but some of these really do not want to be pressed open. So if that is the case, just go ahead and let the paper or the fabric go where it wants to go. It is not the end of the world. We're not even close. All right, and this last one, again, what you're going to do is check to make sure that the edges of the block are lined up straight. And that one's going to be off. Sometimes it's easier for me to just hold it closer to myself so I can get it positioned right instead of having it farther away from me. And it looks like this is one that maybe needs to be eased into place. Okay, so if that happens, what you need to do is change your pins so that your pins are on the top that is a little bit tighter. And so there will be a bow on the bottom. And it could be because I removed some of the papers, but not necessarily. Sometimes it just sometimes it just happens. All right, so this guy I want to have going that way. Okay, so you can see that it's still kind of bowing a little bit. So the part with the extra bulk needs to be on the bottom. And then just go slowly and let the presser foot distribute any of the extra. Okay, so remove your papers, and this time I'm going to remove all of my papers. And there we have the finished block. Doesn't it look great? Great job. You did a fantastic job. I can't wait to see your block. If you would like to sew your own dream lake at Rocky Mountain National Park, you can check out the description box below, and you can also sign up for the monthly subscriptions, and you get 3 patterns a month, and this is one of those monthly patterns. So I will see you in the next video.